The battlefield was a graveyard of broken steel and fallen men, the air heavy with the scent of iron and death. Amidst the carnage, a man groaned in agony, his vision blurring as he realized the wound was fatal. The holy sword had pierced him squarely in the heart, its divine light flickering against the encroaching shadows. Above the din of the dying wind, soldiers cried out in relief, announcing that it was finally done. They cheered with exhaustion, declaring that they had finally caught the devil of the continent, the Necromancer Archimond. As his life ebbed away, Archimond felt himself at death's door. He reflected on the Great Continental War, a brutal conflict that had spanned a decade. It had been a massive joint operation where the Imperial Army acted as the vanguard while a select elite few infiltrated his lines. Though he had anticipated the move and built a defensive line, he ultimately failed. It was a complete defeat, and he knew it was all because of a single knight. Stepping through the snow with heavy, armored footsteps, Berkel Rhineland, the leader of the Northern Knight Order, approached his fallen foe. He looked down at the dying necromancer with a gaze of cold resolve and admitted that he did not achieve this victory with his power alone. He spoke of the countless people who had bled and endured so that, in the end, his sword could finally reach its mark. He commanded Archimond to give up for the sake of the peace of the continent. Archimond's eyes flared with rage, and he screamed for the knight to shut up. He spat back that the knights had stood by and watched while people died from the plague, and now they had the audacity to cry out for peace. He called them worse than dogs and labeled them all hypocrites. He vowed that by his own hands, all humans would perish. Even as his life faded, he channeled his dark energy, using necromancy even in his broken state. The surrounding knights recoiled in shock, their faces pale as they realized the enemy was still casting spells despite his condition. They shouted that it was dangerous and that they had to kill Archimond immediately. Berkel, however, remained calm and told them to stop. He looked at the necromancer and reminded him of the 20 million people who had fallen to the plague, people whom Archimond had used necromancy to turn into his own army. He stated that those deaths were the spark of the war. Archimond let out a bitter laugh, asking Berkel if he thought he did not know that. He pointed out that there must have been people from Berkel's own hometown among those 20 million. He asked if the knight had done all of this just for revenge. Berkel remained silent for a moment before replying that there was only one reason he had come, for the future of the children. For a moment, Archimond's body froze. His choices, convictions, and hopes felt meaningless as he realized he had to leave them behind. In the upright knight's eyes, he saw his own corrupted reflection, a gaze so entirely different from his own. Berkel raised his glowing blade, declaring it was for the sake of his descendants. With a massive impact that shattered the ground, the world went dark. Archimond lay broken, telling the knight to finish him off. Berkel looked down and unexpectedly threw the holy sword aside, the blade clattering against the cold stone. A soldier nearby panicked, warning Berkel about throwing the weapon away. Berkel ignored him and asked Archimond if he had any last words. Archimond smiled through the blood, thinking that a necromancer did not die easily. He whispered that someday he would return. With a final, decisive movement, Berkel ended it. Beyond the cheers of the soldiers, Archimond heard the sound of his own head falling. The 10-year-long war was over. The devil was dead. He felt his consciousness slipping away into the void, marking the end of the necromancer's demise. The darkness was eventually replaced by a swirling void of stars. A violent storm soon raged over a grand estate, lightning illuminating the Gothic architecture. Inside, two maids huddled together in excitement. One asked if the other had seen it, claiming the young master's mouth had just moved. The other gasped in disbelief as they looked down at the small infant. Archimond, now trapped in the tiny body of a baby, was gripped by confusion. He wondered where he was as a maid held up a mirror, telling the young master that the woman in the portrait was the Duchess, his mother. She encouraged him to try saying mama. Archimond felt his body was stiff and struggled to process his situation. When the maid pressed him again, he opened his mouth and let out a series of sounds that were far from a baby's first words. Instead of calling for his mother, the infant's eyes widened with dark intensity. He proclaimed that his guardians of darkness, his servants, and his soldiers must heed his command. He declared that he, Archimond, was summoning them. The maids dropped the mirror in terror as a bolt of blue lightning struck the courtyard fountain, shattering the peace of the night. 15 years passed. The estate's fountain flowed calmly under a clear sky. Maids gossiped as a young man walked past, his silver hair and striking features drawing every eye. They whispered that he was a work of art from the gods, looking as handsome and blinding as ever. Young Master Klein walked with a somber expression, ignoring the praise. Suddenly, a bucket of water was doused over his head, and a booming voice commanded the evil spirit to be gone. Klein stood dripping wet as Garrison Veerman, a priest of the Holy Order, stood over him with a stern gaze. Garrison remarked that Klein had a gaze exactly like Archimond's just a moment ago. He claimed the purification was barely successful. The maids fled in fear as Klein wiped the water from his face, telling the priest it was not easy to spout such nonsense so confidently. He asked if Garrison was not tired of performing the pointless ritual for years. Garrison insisted it was not pointless, explaining that Archimond's soul rested inside Klein's body, requiring periodic purification. Klein snapped back that he was not Archimond, but Garrison ignored him, splashing more water in his face and claiming that was exactly the expression Archimond would make. Klein walked away, thinking the man was a crazy bastard. Garrison, undeterred, ordered his men to get the boy, declaring that for his insolence, Klein would take a holy water bath completely naked. Klein ran, shouting that he was not Archimond and that his name was Klein. He cursed the priest for having no humanity. Submerged in the bath later, Klein reflected on the absurdity of his life. He definitely died that day, his head most certainly cut off. Yet, he had opened his eyes in a baby's body and immediately declared a necromancy incantation. Because of that, he had been treated like a demon and locked in a monastery as soon as he turned 3. That was when he met the man claiming to be a priest. Garrison had loomed over the young Klein, alternating between calling him Archimond and young master. Klein realized that was only the beginning of his suffering. He endured 24-hour prayer chants, frozen garlic baths, and even a fire show of purification. He had been tortured for years under the guise of ritual. Now, 5 years later, a teenaged Klein sat dejectedly wearing a colorful birthday hat. His personal maid, Aaron, prayed that he would live as a healthy descendant of heroes and become a healthy member of the family. Klein, fed up with the sentiment, ripped the hat off and threw it away. Aaron looked devastated, crying that it was a handmade hat. Klein immediately felt a pang of guilt, thinking she must have made it with her own small hands. He started to apologize, saying he went too far and reaching down to pick it up. However, Aaron quickly added that Priest Garrison was actually the one who made it. Klein's expression went cold as his guilt evaporated. Garrison appeared behind him, weeping into a cloth. He sobbed that he had painstakingly knit that hat for a week and was moved to see Klein wearing it. Klein, now thoroughly annoyed, told the priest he was not wearing it anymore and cracked his neck. Garrison gasped, claiming Archimond's evil soul had finally appeared. Klein shouted that he wanted the guilt he felt back and called him a damn priest. The chaos was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Dunkel of the Red Chariot Knight Order. Garrison's demeanor shifted instantly to one of polite professionalism. Klein watched as the priest played along with the knight captain, realizing the man was actually quite good at politics. Garrison prepared to leave, but paused to remind Klein that the next purification ritual was on Friday. He told Klein to keep his body and mind pure with a mocking laugh. Once alone, Klein collapsed onto a sofa, cursing the muscle demon of a priest. Aaron brought him a towel and asked if he really was not Archimond. Klein sighed, stating he hated even hearing the name. He knew that if he admitted the truth, the torture would only get worse. He needed to focus on recovering his body, but the surveillance had been constant since his reincarnation. He had been locked away for 7 years because of the rumors. Klein complained about the priest being a proxy, and Aaron asked what that meant. Dunkel explained that it was a title given to the strongest in the Holy Order. He noted that unless one considered the Dukes of House Rhineland, a proxy was an unmatched powerhouse. Aaron was impressed by the strength of the young master's family and asked who the strongest Duke was. Dunkel admitted that while they were all great, the current 7th Duke was impressive, but the first was the strongest. Klein looked toward a series of portraits on the wall and stated firmly that the first Duke was indeed the strongest. Dunkel agreed, noting it had been 200 years since the first Duke founded the family. Klein stared at the portrait of a golden-haired man, unable to believe the irony of his situation. He realized he had to accept the truth. He, Archimond the Necromancer, had been reincarnated as the descendant of the man who had killed him, Berkel Rhineland. The memory of the final confrontation echoed through the void of time as the defeated necromancer called out the name of his slayer, Berkel. The knight's face was etched with a grim determination as he stated that the only reason he had come was for the children's future. With a final, blinding arc of steel, the hero's blade descended, severing the thread of life and plunging the world into darkness. The vision shattered as a young man bolted upright in his bed with a strangled cry of agony. Gasping for air, the silver-haired youth clutched his face, his heart hammering against his ribs as he realized it was just another crappy dream. This was Klein, but in another life, he was Archimond, the one and only necromancer known as the Devil of the Continent. That life was now a shadow of the past. He had lost himself to rage and nearly tore the continent apart, only to be cut down by the sword of the Northern Knight, Berkel Rhineland. When he next opened his eyes, 200 years had passed, and he had been reborn as that very man's descendant, carrying all his memories intact. He reached up to touch his locks, thinking that even now, he still could not get used to this silver hair. A heavy shadow loomed in the doorway as a voice noted that the young lord had been talking in his sleep quite heavily. Klein flinched at the sudden presence of Priest Garrison, a man he considered a crazy bastard who had spent years torturing him under the guise of purification rituals. Garrison stepped closer, his scarred face wearing a knowing smirk as he asked if Klein had perhaps been dreaming of his days as Archimond. Klein realized he needed to play dumb as best as he could in front of this man and claimed that he had just been a bit tired lately. Before he could say more, the door burst open and his personal maid, Aaron, rushed to his side. She shouted that she had heard everything, mimicking his sleep talking by yelling for the destruction of the continent and the death of all enemies. She even imitated his declaration of command as Archimond. Klein desperately tried to quiet her, asking when he had ever said such things, while Garrison watched with a darkening expression. The interruption continued as the elderly butler, Veerman, knocked at the door to announce that the swordsmanship demonstration was about to begin. Garrison thanked Aaron for her report, his eyes glowing with a menacing light as he noted that young Lord Klein would clearly need double the usual purification ritual time. Klein groaned in frustration, cursing the priest in his mind as he was led away. The grand estate of the Rhineland family stood as a testament to their legacy, centered around a fountain dedicated to their heroic founder. As they walked through the halls, Klein asked about the demonstration. Veerman confirmed that His Grace the Duke had requested Klein's attendance this time. Klein found it strange, as his father had never called him to a demonstration before. Aaron tugged at Klein's sleeve, asking if she could have the snack he was holding, which prompted a scolding from Veerman for her impertinent requests. Klein told the butler not to be too hard on her and handed over the treat, watching as she enjoyed it with unbridled joy. He then turned back to the business at hand, asking why his father had suddenly called for him. Veerman explained that it was because members of the Branch family had arrived. The grand hall was filled with relatives who lived outside the direct bloodline, and Klein immediately identified them as annoying pests. His maternal cousins from his father's side stood in a group, laughing and mocking him as he passed. They called out to him as Lord Archimond, joking about the 7 years he had spent rotting in a monastery and warning each other that he might curse them if they slipped up. Klein observed the different branches, noting the gluttonous relatives from the north and the mysterious cousins from the west. Among them sat a girl with long blonde hair, her gaze sharp and cold. A relative shouted at Klein for ignoring his elders, but Klein ignored them, thinking that he didn't even remember their names. He realized the reason these unfamiliar branch relatives were acting so loud was simple. The family he was born into was falling apart. The fact that they felt comfortable looking down on him, a direct descendant, said everything about their declining prestige. The sound of clashing steel drew everyone's attention to the training floor where a duel was underway. Dalton Cornwell of the Branch family struggled against a superior opponent, groaning as he was pushed back. His opponent, a blonde youth with a calm demeanor, told Dalton to stop holding back and come at him properly. Dalton shouted for him to shut up, claiming he wasn't done yet, but the blonde youth ended the match with a decisive movement. Klein watched his older half-brother, Dellen Rhineland, noting that if there was any hope left in this family, it rested on this prodigious genius. Dellen's reputation as a master of the sword was the only thing holding the Rhineland name together. As Dalton lunged for one final attack, Klein's eyes suddenly flared with a purple light. For the first time in this reincarnated body, he was seeing true swordsmanship. Through his enhanced vision, he could see everything: the footwork, the timing of each push off the ground, and even the flow of mana. He recognized the Rhineland family's secret technique, the meteor sword, as Dellen executed a strike that moved like a falling star. The duel ended instantly. Dellen told the defeated Dalton that he had warned him it would be problematic. The spectators whispered in awe, recognizing the meteor sword as a clear warning to the Branch family that the Rhinelands were still very much alive. Klein rubbed his eye, wondering about the strange sensation he had just experienced. Dellen noticed him and walked over, asking how long he had been there. Klein replied it had only been a moment, and Dellen smiled, saying he would have tried even harder if he knew his little brother was watching. Klein noted that Dellen was the perfect guy, possessing skills, looks, and a great personality. The atmosphere shifted as Heinkel Rhineland, the seventh head of the family, approached. He praised Dellen for already mastering the family's technique. Dellen greeted his father with respect, while Klein watched from the sidelines. To Heinkel, Dellen's existence was his final source of pride. Even the escort knight, Dunkel, noted that Dellen's level of mana and precision was something other knights his age wouldn't even dare attempt. It was quite literally overwhelming talent. Dellen looked embarrassed, claiming it was still not enough. Heinkel reminded him of the dying words of the first Duke, Berkel Rhineland, stating that a knight of Rhineland must always be the greatest in the empire. He told Dellen to engrave those words in his heart. Then, Heinkel's gaze fell upon Klein. He placed a hand on the boy's head and sighed, stating that he still couldn't feel any mana coming from him. Klein looked down and apologized. He realized that showing anger or disappointment was only possible when there was still expectation. Now that his potential was gone in his father's eyes, he was nothing but a worthless burden. Dunkel tried to intercede, suggesting that Klein's lack of progress was because he spent his most critical years confined to the monastery rather than training. However, the whispers of the Branch family were already spreading. They mocked the second son for having no mana, calling him incompetent and claiming that the direct descendants were a disgrace. They argued that the Branch family needed to step up to protect the Rhineland name. Klein clenched his fist, thinking that while he didn't care about insults directed at him, the sight of Berkel's falling family was unbearable. He wondered if the hero had really risked his life for these kinds of people. As the gathering dispersed, Dalton approached Klein with a sneer, mocking a young lord who couldn't even wield a sword. He called Klein an absolute disgrace to the family. Klein didn't flinch, instead retorting that fooling around with girls behind the ballroom was apparently Dalton's Dalton's idea of family pride. Dalton was stunned, asking how he knew about that. Klein asked if he really thought hushed money would stop the rumors or if he was just stupid. Enraged, Dalton spat that he was just taking out his frustration after being crushed by Dylan, calling Klein a fucker. The insult turned personal as Dalton claimed Klein was a bastard who didn't even know who his own mother was. Klein froze, his eyes glowing with a lethal, predatory light as he asked Dalton what he had just said. In his mind, Klein knew it had nothing to do with a mother whose face he had never seen. It was the blatant contempt toward the direct line from people with a pathetic sense of superiority. He wondered how things had sunk this low and why the family of the hero who killed him had become like this. His aura began to flare with a dark, spectral energy until Dunkel intervened, telling Dalton that was enough and that he would not tolerate further disrespect. Dalton clicked his tongue and walked away, calling Klein a coward who was only saved by his escort. Dunkel watched him go before turning to Klein. The boy looked up with a cold, focused expression and asked Dunkel if he happened to have a spare sword. Later that night, in the quiet of the estate grounds, Dunkel handed over a blade, questioning why the young master needed it at such a late hour. Klein began to mimic the movements he had seen earlier, asking if Dylan had swung the sword in that specific way. Dunkel realized Klein was trying to replicate the meteor sword and told him he should head in first, promising to follow. Dunkel watched Klein from a distance, thinking the boy still had lingering attachments to the sword. He felt pity, knowing that a body devoid of mana could never become a knight. He believed that even if Klein perfectly recreated the path of the strike, actually pulling off the meteor sword was impossible without mana. However, as Klein closed his eyes, the scene from earlier was strangely clear in his mind. He recalled the footwork, the timing, the arc of the sword, and the flow of mana. Suddenly, the air around Klein began to crackle. A powerful, dark aura erupted from his body, catching Dunkel off guard. The knight gasped in shock at the sheer intensity of the energy. A massive pillar of purple mana surged into the sky as Klein's eye glowed with an otherworldly light. With a single, devastating swing, Klein unleashed the technique, the force of the blow shattering a massive rock formation nearby. Dunkel stood frozen, stammering the words young master in disbelief. Klein looked at the destruction he had caused with a dark, satisfied smile, realizing that the technique actually worked. Aaron watched with a look of pure horror as Priest Garrison stared intently at a large bucket of water, muttering that it was unbelievable. Beneath the surface of the water, a flurry of bubbles erupted until Klein's head finally broke the surface, gasping for air. Garrison let out a sharp laugh, noting that the boy could now hold his breath underwater for over a minute. The surrounding servants whispered in awe, wondering how he could already manage such a feat and joking that the young master was essentially a fish. Garrison's eyes gleamed with a sadistic light as he suggested that if that were the case, perhaps they should conduct the next purification ritual in a fish tank. Klein spat out a mouthful of water, his face twisted in rage as he shouted that they could forget about a fish tank and demanded to know why the session was taking even longer today. Garrison remained unfazed, simply stating that they were finished, which only prompted another curse from the dripping youth. As the priest walked away, he laughed and explained that he had messed with Klein because he felt a particularly ominous aura coming from his room that morning. Klein grumbled about being targeted for such a trivial reason while Aaron rushed over to offer him a towel to dry off. Their recovery was interrupted by Dunkel, who approached with a sealed envelope and informed young Master Klein that Lord Dalton had sent an invitation for him. Klein looked up, confused, until Dunkel clarified that it was the same Lord Dalton who had sparred with Dylan recently. The message claimed that Dalton wanted to apologize for the incident at the training grounds. Klein's mind flashed back to the moment Dalton had tripped him and mocked his lack of mana. He found it hard to believe the man was actually apologizing. He read the letter, noting it was an invitation to a hunting competition. His thoughts drifted back to Dylan's meteor sword, realizing it was strange for Dalton to reach out after making such a fuss earlier. He suspected the invitation was merely an excuse to draw him out into the open. When Dunkel asked if he planned to go, Klein looked toward his sword and decided there was no reason to refuse, thinking to himself that he had a secret ace up his sleeve. In the quiet of his room, Klein looked at his blade and reflected on Dylan's movements from the other day. He had revisited that swordsmanship over and over in his mind and realized that for some unknown reason, he could perfectly replicate any technique he had seen even once. Dunkel accepted his decision and began preparing a carriage, but the preparations were halted when Garrison appeared, suggesting he should accompany them to the competition. Klein and the others reacted with immediate shock and anger, asking why he would want to go and what kind of nonsense he was planning now. Garrison's expression turned unusually grim as he admitted that for some reason, he felt a lingering, ominous aura today. The carriage eventually made its way through the dense trees toward the western forest. The rough terrain caused the vehicle to jolt violently, making the ride difficult for everyone. Erin clutched her stomach, groaning in misery as she succumbed to motion sickness. Garrison tried to comfort her, but Klein reminded him that the forest was notoriously hard on first-timers. He reached out to offer his pillow to the priest, telling him he would feel better once he lay down for a bit. Garrison looked touched, remarking that the young master had grown up to be such a sweet person, but Klein quickly cut him off. He snapped that the pillow wasn't for the priest and told him to give it to Aaron, asking if Garrison honestly thought he was crazy enough to be nice to him. Klein stared out the window as they traveled, thinking about how much the land had changed. 200 years ago, this very place had been a frozen wasteland covered in snow and the corpses of his fallen army. He was amazed that the ice sheet had survived long enough to melt and transform into such a lush, green forest. He acknowledged that Burkle had done well. Dunkel eventually opened the carriage door, announcing their arrival at the Cornwell family estate. Klein stepped out and surveyed the massive mansion, noting that it looked even more lavish than the Rhineland main house despite being a branch family. He felt a surge of disdain, realizing they had clearly squeezed a fortune out of the direct line to afford such a waste for a simple kids competition. Dalton greeted him with a fake smile, asking what Klein was looking at so intently. He stood beside a pair of snarling, emaciated hunting dogs, boasting about the high ceilings and thick walls of his home. He took a jab at Klein's past, reminding him that he wouldn't know how the world works after being locked in a monastery for 7 years. Klein looked at the starving animals and then met Dalton's gaze with cold indifference, asking since when a hunting competition had turned into a time for idle chat. Dalton's smirk widened as he called Klein an impatient bastard, claiming he had prepared something special just for him. He opened the gates and signaled for the start of the event. A pack of hungry dogs bolted toward the mountainside where raw meat had been scattered as bait. Dalton explained that a starving dog's sense of smell was 100,000 times stronger than a human's. As the crazed beasts ran for the food, Dalton drew his bow and began firing. His arrows found their marks with sickening thuds, and the dogs let out final, pained yelps as they collapsed. Dalton laughed maniacally at his successful hunt, but the festive mood vanished when Aaron approached Klein. Dalton stepped toward her and began patting her head in a patronizing manner, questioning why a brat like Klein kept such a maid around. He grabbed Aaron by the wrist, telling her he would find something else for her to do, but his arm was suddenly caught in a vice-like grip. Klein stood there, his expression terrifyingly calm as he told Dalton to let go before he broke his arm. Dalton recoiled in pain and quickly mounted a horse, shouting for Klein to stop acting tough and to follow him. Klein turned to Dunkel and Aaron, telling them to stay behind and not to follow him. When Dunkel protested that it was too dangerous, Klein handed him a signal magic scroll. He explained that if the priest suddenly disappeared, it was a sign that something had gone wrong, and Dunkel was to tear the scroll immediately. This would alert Klein by making a crest appear on the back of his hand. With those instructions, Klein rode off into the darkening forest. Garrison watched him go from a distance with a suspicious, heavy gaze. As night fell, Klein rode along the forest trail, convinced that Dalton couldn't have gone far. He eventually found him waiting in a clearing where the ground was littered with the fresh carcasses of the hunting dogs. Klein dismounted and asked what kind of game he was trying to pull. Dalton looked down at the dead animals and claimed it was merely the grand finale of the day's competition. He then pointed his sword directly at Klein, declaring that the last prey he intended to kill was him. Klein didn't flinch, asking if Dalton really meant to kill him. Dalton laughed, confirming his plan to cut off Klein's head and present it to Dellen as proof that the Rhineland family was a joke, an empty shell with no power. Dalton snapped his fingers, and a group of armed mercenaries emerged from the shadows surrounding the clearing. He told Klein he wouldn't even have a chance to struggle and mocked him for being born into such a stupid family. He envisioned the gossip that would follow the next day about the fallen sword family of the north and how their young master had died like dog food. Klein looked down, his mind echoing Burkle's words about the children's future, and he suddenly began to laugh. Dalton was taken aback, asking if the boy had lost his mind. Klein's laughter died down as he covered his face, his aura shifting into something ancient and predatory. He thought to himself that a reckless brat was acting arrogant without knowing his place. As his eyes began to glow with a lethal red light, Klein's voice dropped to a low, commanding tone. He reminded the trembling Dalton that the Rhineland family had been built at the cost of his life, and yet the Branch family dared to insult and mock it. A sudden, violent surge of dark energy erupted from Klein, causing the very birds in the trees to scream and flee in terror. Dalton stammered in fear, wondering how Klein could use magic without any mana. Klein corrected him, stating that it wasn't magic, but Magi. Green and blue flames spiraled around him as the mercenaries panicked, unable to comprehend the power they were witnessing. Dalton realized with horror what Klein had just said as the boy began an ancient incantation. Klein called upon the evil spirits buried by time, commanding them to rise and enter the light. Skeletal hands burst from the earth as spirits moaned for something to devour. Dalton's face went pale with the ultimate realization, gasping out the name Archimond. Surrounded by a rising army of the dead, Klein pointed forward and gave a final, chilling command to devour them all until nothing remained of their resentful souls. The dark memories of a past existence resurfaced as the silver-haired youth reflected on what he thought he had forgotten. A long 200 years had passed since those distant days, but he realized he could still feel it. Overlapping endlessly in the dark, the voices of the dead were calling out to him once again. He welcomed the nostalgic sensation, embracing the resonance, the waves, the afterimages, and the memories of his true nature. Dalton stared back in sheer disbelief, sweating as he yelled that this was ridiculous and simply could not be. He cried out the name Archimond as a row of glowing-eyed skeletons stood guard around the boy. Klein wore a dark, knowing smile and acknowledged that he was indeed once called by that name. The mercenaries looked at each other in confusion, wondering if the rumors were true and what exactly they were seeing. One of the men let out a raucous laugh, mocking the boneheads and questioning why a supposed devil would bring out such trash. He bragged about having smashed hundreds of skeletons on missions before and wondered if they were even made of bone. The group laughed, suggesting they take a bone home as a souvenir later. Klein ignored the insults, his eyes cold as he questioned if they really thought his soldiers were trash. Dalton regained his composure and ordered his men to take care of the obstacles in their way. Ranged units loaded their heavy crossbows and fired a massive volley of arrows at the boy. Dalton smirked, thinking poor Klein must be a bloody pulp by now, but his expression quickly turned to shock. The arrows had been caught in a defensive wall of shields that hadn't been there a second ago. Klein remarked that 200 years was a long time, noting that no one seemed to recognize these specific skeletons anymore. He stated that if they were normal skeletons, the mercenaries might have stood a chance, but his were different. Addressing the memory of Burkle in his mind, Klein looked at the descendants of the North and prepared to show them how they would be crushed by his hands. He released the first defensive formation and commanded all forces to charge. Dalton flinched as the skeletons suddenly bolted forward with terrifying speed, reacting with horror as he realized the undead were capable of running. The mercenaries were quickly overwhelmed, their screams echoing through the forest as the skeletons tore through their lines. Dalton desperately tried to command his men to hold the line, but Klein was already giving his next order. He directed the second crossbow unit to surround the enemy from the trees and told them to lock onto their targets. The skeletons in the branches prepared to fire, prompting the mercenaries to run in a panic. Klein whispered the command to fire, and a rain of arrows decimated the remaining men. Dalton watched his forces fall, realizing these were not the skeletons he knew and that they were on the verge of being wiped out. He ordered his men to drop their crossbows and switch to close-quarters combat, but few were left to listen. Dalton lunged forward, swinging his sword with desperate strength and severing the head of a skeleton. He laughed, thinking that aiming for the head was the trick to stopping the undead. Klein's smile only grew wider as he asked if he had not already mentioned that his skeletons were different. Dalton watched in horror as the headless body picked up its own skull and reattached it as if nothing had happened. Klein explained that spiritual bodies summoned with Magi did not die easily and that they followed his orders with tactical precision. The remaining mercenaries trembled, asking why the monsters kept coming back. Klein looked at them with cold detachment, noting that with his current body, 11 summons was his maximum. He asked them if they should continue as the forest was filled with the sound of their dying agony. Back at the estate, Garrison and Aaron sat by the fountain, talking about the young master. Garrison shared stories from when Klein was at the monastery, and Aaron laughed, thinking it was just like him. Garrison noted how much Aaron seemed to really like the boy, and she enthusiastically agreed, claiming the young master was wonderful. While Klein was currently covered in blood and directing a massacre, Aaron spoke of how kind, sweet, and warm he was, even remembering how he shared his cookies with her. She called him the warmest person in the world just as Klein pointed a lethal finger at his enemies. Dalton realized that at the very least, he had to stop the regeneration by taking out the summoner. He charged at Klein with a roar, telling him to stop playing dead and declaring that undead or not, he would die once his head was gone. Klein watched the blade descend, his purple eye glowing with a violent intensity. He realized he could see the attack perfectly with the power of his eye, recalling the technique he had seen only once before. He channeled the secret art of the Rhineland family, unleashing the meteor sword in a brilliant flash of purple energy. Dalton stood frozen as blood erupted from his chest, his eyes wide in shock as he recognized Dellen's technique. Klein leaned in close, his gaze lethal, and told Dalton not to think he would die a peaceful death. He announced that the judgment was now beginning. Dalton coughed violently, his blood staining the grass as his life force ebbed away. Standing over his fallen enemy, Klein looked down with a cold, analytical gaze and remarked that Dalton was right about one thing. If the caster was killed, all of a Necromancer's creations would lose their power. He reflected on his past life, realizing that Archimond had failed to overcome that very weakness and was defeated because of it. He watched the blue Magi flicker around his hand, a power that once belonged to the devil who wielded it, and found it ironic that the very thing giving him the strength to protect protect his current life was the noble blood of the Rhinelands. The blood of his ancient enemy had made him even stronger, and as a member of this new body, he could no longer turn away from that destiny. Dalton could only muster a confused whisper, asking what he meant, before his eyes clouded over and he fell silent. Klein stood tall in the darkness, his voice a low promise to the memory of Burkle, telling the hero to look forward to the future as he vowed to rebuild the ruined Rhineland family himself. Dalton's consciousness drifted into a suffocating void. He groaned in confusion, wondering where he was as the absolute darkness pressed in on him. He couldn't see a thing, but a heavy, metallic sensation weighed on his limbs. He realized he was strapped into a jagged, spiked throne, his wrists and ankles bound by cold iron. He gasped in shock, asking what was happening, when a voice cut through the shadows, noting that he was finally awake. A figure stepped forward, revealing a face identical to the Necromancer from the legends. The man explained that this was the place where souls arrived beyond the world they once lived in, an afterlife created specifically by Archimond. Dalton trembled, whispering the name of the devil's afterlife in terror. Archimond confirmed it with a cold nod. He reminded Dalton of his life of cruelty, noting how he had starved and tortured dogs, routinely abusing them under the guise of hunting. He vividly recalled the look of joy on Dalton's face during those moments of malice. Dalton lashed out in a panic, yelling for the figure to stop spouting nonsense and to make sense of the situation. He demanded to be released immediately, but his bravado crumbled as he paused to process his memories. He remembered his body being cut down by Klein's meteor sword and wondered why he now appeared perfectly fine. Archimond watched him with detached eyes and stated simply that Dalton was already dead. He explained that he was merely returning the karma of Dalton's past life, as that was the singular role of this afterlife. Dalton screamed that it couldn't be true and ordered the spirit to let him go. Archimond ignored the pleas, stating that it didn't matter whether Dalton believed it or not. As blue flames erupted around his hand, he declared that the time had come for Dalton to pay for his sins. From the shadows, the emaciated hunting dogs Dalton had slaughtered emerged, their eyes glowing with a vengeful blue light. Dalton's breath hitched as Archimond told him to listen closely to the howls of the lives he had taken. He commanded Dalton to remember that this place was the hell he had created for himself. The dogs lunged, and Dalton's screams of pure agony filled the void. He cried out that it hurt, begging for mercy as the beasts tore into him, until a single tear fell and the vision of the afterlife faded into nothingness. Back in the physical world, Klein stood amidst the carnage of the forest as the last of his skeletal summons stood at attention. He looked at the remains of Dalton and noted that the skeletons had followed his requests perfectly. As a reward for their service, he raised his hand and channeled his Magi, telling them he would break the curse binding them and grant them freedom. The skeletal warriors dissolved into shimmering particles of light, scattering into the wind. Klein watched them go, thinking that true death was when bones were allowed to shatter and scatter. He wondered why he had been brought back to life and for what ultimate purpose. His reflections were cut short by a voice from the shadows, noting how unexpected it was for young Master Klein to wield necromancy. Klein flinched, wondering if the stranger had seen everything, and demanded to know who was there. A hooded figure stepped into the moonlight, refusing to give his name and claiming Klein wouldn't be able to do anything with the information anyway. The man raised a glowing orb of green energy, and the dead mercenaries and dogs suddenly twitched. Klein realized with a start that the man was using a revival art to control the corpses. He identified the stranger as another necromancer. The hooded man smirked, noting that while Dalton may have failed, the fresh corpses would be quite useful. At the edge of the forest, Aaron was still trying to entertain Dunkel with stories of the young master's childhood, but the knight was no longer listening. Dunkel stared at the signal magic scroll in his hand, wondering why Klein had been carrying an emergency item in the first place. He grew increasingly anxious, noting that it had already been 3 hours since the boy entered the forest with Lord Dalton and there was still no news. He felt a heavy weight in his gut and decided he couldn't just wait any longer. As he prepared to mount his horse, several of Dalton's guards blocked his path, telling him it would be problematic if he left his post while the competition was ongoing. Dunkel's gaze sharpened as he noticed the Conwell family crest on their armor. He realized they were Dalton's escorts and that they clearly had an ulterior motive. He introduced himself as the commander of the Rhineland family's exclusive night order and Klein's personal escort, warning them that if they tried to stop him again, he would not stand idly by. The guards gulped and stepped back, intimidated by his resolve. Aaron asked if something was wrong, and Dunkel told her to listen carefully. He explained that the young master was taking too long and he was going to look for him. He ordered Aaron to return to the mansion with the priest, but she confused him by saying the priest had already left a few minutes ago. Dunkel was stunned to hear that Garrison had vanished without a word, especially since he had looked so serious. He realized the priest's ominous feeling had been correct all along. He remembered Klein's warning about tearing the scroll if the priest disappeared and realized it wasn't a coincidence. He cursed his hesitation and ripped the magic scroll with his teeth, feeling a surge of urgency as he realized something had definitely happened to the young master. He spurred his horse forward, racing into the dark trees. Deep in the woods, Klein stood his ground against the rival necromancer's puppets. He realized his Magi was completely depleted from the previous battle and that he wouldn't last long in a physical confrontation without his own summons. The hooded man ordered his undead to move and eliminate Klein. As the corpses swarmed toward him, Klein looked at his glowing palm and thought that the man was foolish to think he could win just because they used the same art. A blinding bolt of holy light suddenly descended from the heavens, incinerating the undead in a massive explosion of divine energy. A familiar figure landed in the center of the clearing, telling the young master to be at ease now because he had arrived. The hooded man gasped in shock, asking who the newcomer was. The man looked up with a scarred face and a lethal intensity, identifying himself as a proxy of the Holy Order. Garrison Veerman prepared for battle, declaring that he was moving out. The legends of the Holy Order spoke of the proxies, 3 human weapons who absolutely executed the Pope's commands with unwavering devotion. As the strongest military force possessed by the Order, they were the only ones capable of wielding the holy artifacts left by Saint Gall. It was said that their individual power rivaled that of a fortress, a fact that became terrifyingly clear as a massive pillar of golden light descended from the heavens. The holy energy incinerated the skeletal remains of the forest, leaving the hooded necromancer to gasp in horror as he was thrown backward by the shockwave. Among the proxies, the one who boasted the title of the strongest through pure martial prowess alone stood before the silver-haired youth at that very moment. Garrison Veerman looked back at his charge with a calm, almost predatory smile, telling the young master not to worry because he had finally arrived. Without a second of hesitation, Garrison vanished into a blur of motion. He moved through the undead puppets like a gust of wind, his heavy footsteps thudding against the grass as he reached the first corpse. With a violent impact, he slammed his holy book into the creature's face, declaring to the sinners that they should prepare themselves. Garrison's eyes glowed with a lethal amber light as he commanded the remaining undead to beg and plead for mercy. He promised that he would grant them a baptism of fire to wash away their sins, his voice carrying the weight of a divine executioner. He moved with impossible speed, his strikes shattering the revived corpses into bloody fragments. He noted that this display was both mercy and judgment, punctuating his words by slamming his artifact down with enough force to crater the earth. The hooded necromancer watched with wide, trembling eyes, realizing with a start that the power he was witnessing was completely insane. He panicked, realizing that a proxy of the Holy Order was a variable he had never accounted for, and turned to flee into the woods while cursing the fact that this was not part of the deal. The man's escape was short-lived. He sprinted through the trees, gasping that the situation was completely absurd, but he was suddenly jerked backward as his mask fell to the forest floor with a dull thud. Garrison's hand clamped around the man's throat like a vice, hoisting him into the air. The necromancer struggled, wheezing that he couldn't breathe and begging for a minute to speak, but Garrison remained cold. He told the man that he hadn't finished the prayer yet and that he should be thankful this judgment was being passed upon him. In the name of the light, Garrison exerted a crushing force, and a final, blinding flare of energy signaled the end of the assailant. The forest fell silent as a severed mask rolled toward Klein's feet. Garrison stood in the clearing and addressed the boy, who was sweating and visibly shaken. Klein realized that the priest had merely taken a step and walked forward, yet his mere presence had seemingly torn over 20 bodies apart. The power of a proxy was beyond anything Klein had expected for his current era. Garrison approached, his blood-stained hand reaching out as he thought about how he had felt the energy of necromancy and rushed over immediately. He placed his hand on Klein's shoulder, noting that it was quite strange. He looked into Klein's eyes and remarked that the dark energy he felt didn't seem to belong to the man he had just killed. Klein felt a chill run down his spine, realizing this bastard was testing him and that one wrong move would mean his death right then and there. The tension was broken by the sound of galloping hooves as Dunkel arrived, shouting the young master's name in a panic. He skidded to a halt and asked if Klein was all right. Klein looked at Garrison's hand and then at his own trembling fingers, realizing that using necromancy with his current underdeveloped body had been too much. His vision blurred and he began to collapse, prompting Dunkel to leap from his horse and catch him. Dunkel yelled in a frenzy, asking what had happened and why there was so much blood. Klein told him to stop shouting since he could hear just fine, admitting that his legs had simply gave out. When Dunkel asked where Lord Dalton was, Klein replied with cold honesty that he had killed him because Dalton had tried to assassinate him. The scene shifted to the grand hall of the Rhineland estate, where Count Delcan Conwell slammed his hand against a table in a fit of rage. He roared at the assembly, asking what they meant by Dalton trying to assassinate a direct descendant. He screamed that his son was a man of honor and loyalty, claiming it was a disgusting frame job against a dead man. Heinkel Rhineland, Klein's father, stood his ground and held up a document. He stated that even after long hours of interrogation, Klein had not changed his statement. Furthermore, he revealed a record showing that the Conwell domain had dispatched 20 private mercenaries around the same time the two disappeared, making it clear that Dalton was plotting something. Delcan broke into a cold sweat, cursed his subordinates for leaving evidence in his mind, but he quickly changed his tactic. He argued that Dalton was skilled enough to join the Night Order while Klein had never even held a sword. The surrounding nobles whispered in agreement, recalling Heinkel's own admission that Klein possessed no magic power. Delcan realized he would be finished if the assassination attempt was proven, so he pivoted to a more personal attack. He brought up Klein's mother, Archduchess Claire, and the bizarre rumors that had surrounded her, accusing Klein of being a delusional child who claimed to be Archimond. He yelled that Klein must have hired someone else to kill Dalton and was now pinning the blame on his son. A calm, sharp voice commanded them to be silent. Klein walked into the hall, telling the Count that he had been listening and that there seemed to be nothing the man wouldn't say. He reiterated that Dalton hired mercenaries and that he had killed the man in self-defense. He added that when an unknown assailant appeared and turned the bodies into undead, Priest Garrison arrived to provide assistance. Delcan called him a liar, but Klein's eye flared with a red glow as he asked if the Count thought the rumors of him being Archimond were the only true thing. Klein watched the man's fear grow and felt a surge of conviction. He had made a vow to rebuild this family with his own hands, and he would not stand to see it dirtied by the vermin of the branch families. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the confrontation. A woman with long golden hair and a striking presence apologized for her tardiness. She introduced herself as Laia, the commander of the Blue Holy Spear Knights. Klein recognized her from the demonstration but wondered why someone from the Fullwyvern family was here. Count Delcan questioned her presence, but Heinkel explained that he had permitted it because Dalton had received a mission in her Night Order, giving her a right to attend. Laia didn't look at the Count. Instead, her sharp gaze locked onto Klein. After a moment of silence, she requested a private word with the young lord. Klein was confused, wondering why she wanted him specifically. Heinkel permitted the meeting as long as it was brief and told Klein not to take too long. As they walked away, Klein felt frustrated by the constant demands of the knights, but he quickly realized this was an opportunity. He narrowed the possibilities down to 3 reasons: verification, suspicion, or testing. He told his father he understood and followed Laia into a private chamber. He decided it didn't matter what her goal was. He had set his target and wouldn't run away. Whether it was the Fullwyverns or anyone else, he would turn the situation to his advantage. Inside the quiet room, the sound of Laia's boots echoed against the floor as she approached him. She stopped just inches away, her expression unreadable as she whispered for him to say something. She moved closer, pinning Klein against the wall with a sudden, forceful motion. Her breathing was heavy as she looked him in the eye and asked if she could touch him. Klein's eyes widened in total shock as he struggled to process the unexpected request, wondering what on earth she was planning to do now. Laia Wren Paul Wyvern stood as a figure of formidable power, the eldest daughter of the Paul Wyvern family and commander of the Blue Sacred Spear Knights. She was a master of her craft, her skills rivaling the legendary warriors of the Rhineland line. The official records told a tale of a solo suppression operation in the Western Forest, where she had single-handedly exterminated high-ranking monsters to ensure civilian safety. As she led the way through the estate, Laia told the boy to hurry up and follow her. Klein trailed behind, thinking that she shouldn't try to act so friendly since they weren't even real family. He recalled Heinkel's explanation that his aunt was the Duke's second wife, making Laia his cousin. However, since she was the daughter of the first wife, they shared no biological blood. To him, they were complete strangers. Turning toward him with a look of personal curiosity, Laia asked if she could touch him. Klein was taken aback, wondering what she meant and why she was asking so suddenly. Before he could protest, she reached out and grabbed his hand firmly. She noted the soft and smooth texture, observing that there wasn't a single scar or blister on his skin. She remarked that it was like a baby's hand. Klein felt a surge of discomfort, wondering why she was feeling up his hand. Laia continued her examination, explaining that even well-trained swordsmen who lacked calluses still had hardened areas where they gripped the hilt. She pressed on his index finger and the inside of his thumb, stating that tendons could not lie. She looked him straight in the eyes and asked if he had ever actually used a sword. She found it impossible to believe that someone with no trace of weapon use could defeat an official knight like Dalton and 20 mercenaries. She leaned in closer, questioning if he had used some other power. Klein pulled back with a sharp movement, asking if she wanted to know if he was Archimond too. He realized this girl was dangerous and that her gaze was meant to gauge his reaction rather than just get an answer. He knew silence or hesitation would be seen as a confirmation. To counter her, he decided to be more confident than his opponent. He wore a sharp grin and asked what if he was indeed Archimond. Laia burst into a derisive laugh, asking as if it were even possible for a brat like him to be the legendary Necromancer. Klein was stunned by the insult, his mouth hanging open in shock. She repeated the word, telling him he was way too small to be Archimond. She listed his faults, claiming his proportions were bad, his voice was too high, and he didn't have an ounce of presence. In a word, she called him a little brat. Klein felt the weight of her words like severe internal damage. Laya then leaned in and whispered that if someone like him could actually defeat a knight, she would give him her lips. Klein stood frozen, his mind unable to think rationally. He wondered if this was a political move or some form of bribery. Laya stepped away, noting that they were going to be late and they should head inside. As she walked away into the sunset, she thought to herself that Archimond would never have acted that way. They entered the hall, where Klein admitted to himself that he had been too complacent. He knew the assembly saw him only as the nuisance second son who had been held by the Holy Order. It was natural they wouldn't believe his claim of self-defense. Delcan Conwell stared him down as Heinkel asked what the two of them had discussed. Instead of answering, Klein drew his sword and slammed the tip into the floor with a resounding impact. He looked at Delcan and stated that he would prove the truth himself. He declared that they should settle this like northern men and challenged the Count to a trial by combat. The room erupted in shock at the mention of the ancient judicial method. It was a tradition used when a verdict was difficult to reach, where the winner of a duel dictated the truth without restriction on weapons or techniques. Delcan stammered that the request was sudden, but Klein cut him off. He stated there were plenty of reasons, listing the assassination attempt and the insults directed at both him and his mother. Internally, Klein acknowledged that while he bore the name, he felt no affection for the mother of this second life. He told the Count to hurry and decide, asking if he planned on keeping everyone waiting. The crowd whispered about the return of the old tradition. Heinkel officially guaranteed the duel, declaring that the outcome would decide everything and render all prior evidence void. Delcan saw this as a chance. He thought about the rumors of Klein having no mana and planned to send a champion in his stead. He vowed to have the little brat killed. Klein retorted that it didn't matter and that the Count would simply have to watch how he butchered Dalton's replacement. He told Delcan to go to hell. The Count accepted, setting the duel for 4 days later. Klein knew this was just the beginning. He would use Conwell as a stepping stone to show the branch families exactly who he was and how he would overhaul the family. Later that night at the estate, Dellen shouted in protest, asking if Klein was out of his mind. He grabbed Klein by the shoulders, warning him that he could die in a trial by combat. Klein remained calm, telling his brother that he knew the risks and that their father had already given permission. Dellen offered to step in as Klein's champion, but Klein immediately refused. He explained that the branch families only stayed in line because of the strength of the Duke and Dellen. If Dellen fought, it would give them a legal opportunity to kill the heir of Rhineland. Klein stated he needed this victory to change his own reputation and had no reason to yield. Dellen looked away in silence, remembering the day Klein was born. He recalled running to see his little brother and thinking the infant looked like an angel. He told Klein it didn't matter if they had different mothers. He spoke of the 7 years he had waited to get his brother back from the Holy Order, and now he was faced with the possibility of losing him again. Tears ran down Dellen's face as he gripped Klein's clothes. Klein watched him, surprised to see his strong brother crying. Dunkel entered the room and apologized for the interruption. He informed them that Count Conwell had already designated his champion. He identified the man as Randall, an excommunicated knight who had made a terrifying name for himself in battle. He explained that the reason for the man's excommunication was uncontrollable bloodlust. In a dark tavern, a massive, muscular man sat beneath the mounted head of a lion. He poured a cup of wine down his throat, his body covered in the scars of countless battles. Surrounding him were the groaning, broken bodies of men he had already defeated. Randall looked toward the door with a predatory glint in his eye, noting the young master of Rhineland. He remarked with a cruel smile that it had been a while since he had heard the screams of a little boy. Klein's expression remained cold and unreadable as the duel approached. Dunkel handed over the weapon, stating that it was the sword Klein had requested and that he had crafted it exactly as asked. He warned the boy to be careful, explaining that the moment it clashed with a mana-infused blade, it would shatter. Klein looked at the hilt and noted that it was good, telling Dunkel they should head out right away. Stepping out into the brilliant sunlight of the arena, Klein made his entrance as the crowd began to murmur in surprise. They whispered to one another that Lord Klein had actually showed up, their voices filled with disbelief. High in the stands, Delcan Conwell laughed and remarked to Heinkel that he was surprised to see the boy come out in person. He asked if Heinkel was truly okay with the match, noting that his champion was a knight from the Empire who might be quite a handful for a mana-less son. He suggested that it was not too late to send out Lord Dellen instead. Heinkel remained silent, his gaze fixed on the arena as he wondered where the opponent had gone. Klein looked around the dusty floor, noting that his opponent had not yet come out. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over him as a colossal hand reached down. A hulking, scarred man named Randall stood before him, identifying himself as Conwell's champion. He He observed that Klein was much younger than he had heard and noted that the boy's arms were remarkably thin. Randall voiced a cruel curiosity, wondering what sound Klein would make when his neck snapped. With a sudden burst of speed, Randall lunged forward, but Klein moved backward with a fluid motion that left the crowd questioning what they had just seen. They wondered if the boy had actually just run backward with such agility. Delcan turned to Heinkel, asking if he saw that and questioning if Klein could really handle the duel when he was acting so jumpy before it even truly started. Randall mocked Klein, claiming he already looked terrified. Klein felt a bead of sweat roll down his face, admitting to himself that the sudden movement had startled him. It reminded him of when the priest had grabbed his shoulder, and he realized he had chickened out for a second without even thinking. He cursed the priest, thinking the man was useless right up to the very end and only knew how to perform water torture. From the sidelines, Laya watched with a sharp gaze. Her captain warned her that Lady Helion would be furious if she found out she was here and suggested they head back. Laya replied that she didn't care because that woman was not her mother anyway. She added that if Klein managed to beat that knight, she would give him her lips, as there was something she still needed to confirm. Klein cleared his throat, feeling a bit embarrassed. He made an excuse, claiming he had a stiff neck lately and telling Randall he had better not touch his shoulder. Randall ignored the warning and clamped a massive hand onto Klein's shoulder, pulling him close. Klein's eyes went cold as he called the man a perverted bastard and asked if his ears were stuffed with muscles too. Randall flinched at the insult but quickly recovered with a grin. He noted that the Empire had abandoned Klein for a reason and suggested that the fouler his mouth was, the more he would have to scream later. Randall swung a massive fist downward with a thunderous impact that shattered the ground and sent a cloud of dust into the air. Randall stood over the crater, holding nothing but Klein's empty coat. He wondered what was happening as the crowd gasped at the power that had shattered the stone. They shouted that Lord Klein had disappeared, but Klein soon reappeared a short distance away, now dressed only in his red vest. He took a breath, noting that the bastard had a nasty temper. He realized that a head-on clash would be tough and that if he took a direct hit from that massive body, he would be the one flying apart. He admitted that this was not a situation where he could take it easy. Dellen watched from the stands with a worried expression, thinking that Klein had dodged well but wondering how he could possibly beat a monster like that. He knew that even a graze would shatter his brother's bones and feared Klein was just walking to his death. He recalled their conversation where he had warned Klein that the trial by combat was a legal excuse for the branch families to kill the Rhineland heir. Klein had acknowledged the risk but insisted that this was necessary to change his reputation. Randall charged again, and Klein focused his purple eye on the massive knight. As Randall swung his heavy blade, Klein leapt and caught himself on a nearby pillar before sliding back down to the ground. Randall shouted, asking if Klein thought he could win just by dodging. He taunted the boy, telling him to use his necromancy and asking if he wasn't supposed to be the great Archimond. Klein's expression darkened as he thought about how annoying the situation had become. For a moment, he considered using necromancy to end everyone there. Randall felt a sudden, crushing surge of fear and backed away, sensing an ominous aura. The crowd was confused, wondering if Randall was going easy on him, but the champion was sweating, feeling a ghostly specter looming behind the boy. Delcan wondered why Randall was acting so strangely, but Heinkel watched in silence. Klein stepped forward and told Randall not to worry, because he would not use anything like necromancy. He declared that because he was a Rhineland, this was a place to prove himself entirely with a sword. He promised not to use his dark arts. Dellen whispered his brother's name as the crowd erupted into cheers, shouting for Lord Klein and praising the duel as a true trial by combat. Delcan grew nervous while Randall tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence. Randall insisted he was leagues above the boy in strength and reminded himself that the brat had no mana. He powered up, his muscles bulging as he explained that the strength of imperial swordsmanship lay in not holding back. By pushing every sense, muscle, and drop of blood to the limit, he could hunt down an opponent with explosive power. Randall leapt into the air, screaming for the Rhineland to die. Klein stood his ground, his purple eye crackling with energy as he analyzed the technique, the mana capacity, and the arc of the blade. Randall swung with all his might, calling Klein a damn fly, but the boy dodged the overhead strike. Randall struck the ground with a massive explosion, but when the dust settled, he realized Klein had disappeared again. He wondered if the boy had actually read every trajectory of his sword in such a short time. Klein appeared behind Randall, noting that with a body that size, his back was completely exposed. With a brilliant flash of purple light, Klein executed the meteor sword. The strike tore through Randall's defenses, and the crowd shouted in shock, recognizing the Rhineland family's secret art. Dellen and Heinkel were stunned as Randall let out a scream of agony, unable to comprehend how a boy with no mana could perform such a feat. Klein's purple eye glowed with triumph as the massive knight collapsed. Laya's captain asked if she had just seen that, but the commander remained silent, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide with wonder as she stared at the young master. Normally, I would have stepped in myself, Heinkel Rhineland thought as he sat at his heavy wooden desk, his fingers interlaced in a moment of rare vulnerability. Dunkel watched him from across the room, noting his master's distress and acknowledging the gravity of the situation. Heinkel sighed, admitting to himself that he could not act on personal feelings alone, for if he stepped forward now, the prestige of the Rhineland family would only fall further. He looked down at the documents before him, realizing that since the opponent was a knight from the Empire, Klein had absolutely no chance of winning. When Dunkel asked why he had permitted the duel in the first place, Heinkel looked up with a weary gaze. He explained that the boy had stepped up specifically to defend the honor of his late mother. He reflected on the past, remembering how he could not save Klein even when the boy was falsely branded as Archimond and locked away in a monastery for 7 years. He wondered what right he had to stop him now, concluding that in the end, he simply could not protect anything, not his child nor his family. Dunkel told his grace that he did not need to worry, reassuring him that young Master Klein did not fight losing battles. On the training grounds, the air crackled with energy as Klein's blade tore through Randall's defenses. Heinkel gasped, realizing the truth as he watched the battle unfold with new eyes. The northern swordsmanship family, Rhineland, had a distinct style born from necessity. To endure the brutal frozen fields of the north, they pared their mana consumption down to the absolute minimum to preserve their strength. While imperial swordsmanship was akin to predation, like a lion overwhelming its opponent by unleashing mana all at once, the Rhineland style was defined by temperance. Like a falcon striking from the sky, they focused on hitting the opponent's opening with minimal mana, creating the ultimate swordsmanship that drew maximum efficiency from minimum power. Klein gripped his blade firmly, thinking that this was how someone like him, who lacked mana, could still wield his family's legendary techniques. He acknowledged that while it might lack raw power, it was more than enough to beat a guy like Randall. Randall's face twisted in rage, his teeth bared in a feral snarl as he called Klein a little rat. A massive shockwave of blood-red energy erupted from the giant knight as he screamed in fury. The spectators recoiled in shock, recognizing the onset of Randall's secret technique. It was a mana burst designed to instantly seal an opponent's movements through sheer physical pressure. Randall loomed like a demonic lion, his red aura pulsing as he prepared for a final, lethal strike. He bellowed for the boy not to make him laugh and declared that he was the one who would win. Klein stood his ground, his eyes narrowing as the red pressure washed over him. Dellen watched from the stands in terror, shouting for Klein to watch out. Randall lunged with a massive overhead strike, and their blades met with a deafening clash of steel on steel. Just as Dunkel had warned, the moment the weapon clashed with a mana-infused sword, it began to fail. Sparks flew as the blade shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. Randall laughed with a cruel, distorted joy, claiming that it served the boy right and that his sword was now useless. He stopped abruptly as he saw Klein's face through the falling shards of steel. A dark, predatory smile played on the boy's lips, and his purple eye flared with an ancient, terrifying light. Klein whispered that now it was finally complete, calling his broken blade the weapon to hunt his foe. The image of the lion was suddenly replaced by that of a focused predator. Like a feather falling silently before a strike, Klein moved with impossible speed. With a single, explosive movement, he bypassed Randall's guard. A massive splash of blood painted the arena floor as a severed hand flew into the sky. Randall stood in stunned silence, his eyes bulging as his sword fell into the dirt. Heinkel's voice carried across the silent arena, announcing that the duel was over. The spectators watched in awe, a few swallowing hard at the sight of the boy standing over the giant. Dunkel reflected on the young master's prowess, noting that while Rhineland swordsmanship could be performed with minimal mana, such a feat was usually reserved for a seasoned knight. Yet, Klein had flawlessly executed every detail, from the footwork to the sword's trajectory. He realized with a start that Klein had deliberately baited Randall into breaking his sword just so he could deliver a strike from point-blank range. Randall let out a guttural scream of pure agony, clutching his bloody stump and wailing about his hand. Healers rushed onto the field, shouting for the bleeding to be stopped and for a sleep spell to be cast to manage the knight's shock. Klein watched them work with detached interest, his purple eye slowly returning to normal. Klein asked if the hand could be reattached, his voice disturbingly calm. The healer looked up, stammering that basic healing magic wouldn't be enough and that they would need to make a cast for a prosthetic arm instead. Klein looked away, thinking that even after 200 years, healing magic had not really advanced much at all. Heinkel walked onto the field and called out his son's name, noticing that the boy felt absolutely nothing even after seeing a severed limb. Klein froze for a second, realizing his mistake. He thought to himself that he was not supposed to be Archimond right now and wondered if he should pretend to be scared to maintain his cover. Delcan Conwell was in a state of frantic disbelief, shouting that it made no sense for Randall to lose after how much money he had spent to hire him. Heinkel told the Count to be silent and commanded him to meet the winner's demands as agreed. Delcan screamed in refusal, claiming he had lost both his son and his exclusive knight. His words were cut short by a sudden, invisible force as Klein's purple eye fixed on him. Klein spoke the Count's name with a voice that seemed to echo from the grave. grave. A massive pressure slammed into Delcan, forcing him to his knees with a heavy impact. The Count gasped, his eyes wide with a terror he could not explain as he clutched his neck, feeling as if it had been severed by a ghost. Klein leaned down and spoke as the victor of the duel, commanding the man to confess his sins. Klein utilized the dead man's voice, a soul-disturbing technique exclusive to necromancers that induced extreme terror in the living. He commanded Delcan to bow his head and beg for mercy, telling him he would be crushed under the weight of his sins and repent for eternity. A dark, spectral energy swirled around them, and Delcan's mind broke under the weight of the chant. Tears streamed down his face as he sobbed, admitting he was wrong and confessing that he and his son had dared to try and harm the young master. He begged for forgiveness, muttering incoherently about how he had insulted Grand Duchess Claire. The crowd watched in confusion as a pillar of the Branch family crumbled before their eyes. Klein stood tall, watching the broken man and thinking that this was only the beginning. He raised the hilt of his broken sword and addressed the assembly. "Everyone standing here, listen closely," Klein shouted, his voice ringing with newfound authority. He called it a declaration of his existence to set the family right, identifying himself as the victor of the trial by combat. He proclaimed himself as the son of Grand Duchess Claire Le Delacis and the second son of the North's strongest knight, Heinkel Rhineland. He shouted his name, Klein Rhineland, to the heavens. Meanwhile, in a grand, dimly lit cathedral, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed as Priest Garrison approached an altar. Cardinal Maroc sat in prayer, murmuring about going where the light does not reach and asking the God of Light to watch over their intent. Garrison called out the cardinal's name, and the old man asked what the matter was, noting how grim the priest's voice sounded. Garrison stepped into the light and reported that the surveillance target was attacked by a necromancer and his undead. Maroc told him there was no need to worry because it was all part of a larger plan. He explained that the necromancer had been dispatched in cooperation with the Empire to incite fear, forcing people to seek out God and flock to the Holy Order. He claimed that reviving the Order was worth a handful of sacrifices. Garrison's face was a mask of cold fury as he realized a servant of the Holy Temple had fallen for petty political games and made deals with heretics. Without a word, he grabbed Maroc by the throat and lifted him into the air. Maroc struggled and wheezed for someone to save him until a sickening crack echoed through the cathedral. Garrison dropped the lifeless body as Archbishop Palamon L stepped out from the shadows. Palamon asked if the priest felt any better, noting that Garrison had not changed and had killed more clergymen than the necromancers had. He suggested that the order ought to know what Garrison was hiding inside his gut. Garrison looked at the archbishop and asked if this was his doing. Palamon denied it, claiming he merely authorized it, and revealed a cross-shaped vial containing traces of necromancy from the scene. He explained that the vial contained two distinct types of energy, a soul-returning art used to raise corpses and a technique that manipulated souls rather than just bodies. He noted that the latter was the original form of necromancy, meaning there were two necromancers at the scene. He looked at Garrison and delivered the final, chilling revelation that his surveillance target, the second son of the Rhineland family, was a necromancer. A torrential downpour hammered against the roof of a secluded shack as a miner swung his pickaxe with rhythmic strikes, shattering rocks in search of ore. Unbeknownst to him, a massive clawed shadow loomed over his back. As he paused to catch his breath, he felt a presence and turned only to see a terrifying silhouette. His scream echoed through the rainy night before he was dragged into the abyss. Back at the Rhineland estate, Erin looked at a small plush creation in her hands and lamented that it was a disaster, though she had managed to make a doll that looked exactly like the young master's face. She laughed nervously, hoping for a reaction, but Klein remained silent as he sat in his study. A week had passed since the trial by combat where he had defeated Randall with his family's technique and extracted a confession from Count Conwell. He had publicly announced his existence to the Branch family, hoping to finally be acknowledged. However, the real problem was that his 15-year-old body lacked the stamina to keep up with his ambitions. He told Erin that if she was done playing, she should hurry to her room and sleep. Erin huffed in annoyance, complaining that the young master was mean for always playing by himself. Klein questioned what she meant by playing, pointing out that he was clearly reading. Erin dismissed it as just a novel, but as Klein flipped the pages, he knew the truth. While the cover was ordinary, the inside was filled with his secret notes on anatomy, magic circuits, and spell formations, everything he knew about necromancy. He reflected on his current limitations, noting that he could only summon 11 skeletons at most. While his control was stable, he lacked the numbers for a war of attrition and needed more research. His thoughts turned to the suspicious priest Garrison, who looked ready to exterminate any trace of a necromancer. Klein realized he had to regain his original power before the priest came looking for him, but he wondered how to do so without being caught. The answer came when Heinkel presented a report regarding sightings of the undead at a nearby mine. Klein's eyes widened with interest as he looked at the drawings of the creatures, thinking to himself that this was the perfect opportunity. He volunteered to go, arguing that real combat was the best form of research. Heinkel asked if he would be alright given the reports of casualties, but Klein assured him it wouldn't be a problem. He knew that since the trial, Heinkel finally acknowledged him, and this mission mission provided a chance to use necromancy to his heart's content. Dunkel accompanied him for safety, and as they camped under the amazing night sky, the knight offered Klein a skewer of hot meat. Klein accepted it but noted that Dunkel, despite being a knight commander, was completely useless when it came to cooking or hunting, as evidenced by a lump of charcoal on the ground. Dunkel apologized with embarrassment, and Klein told him to forget it, claiming he had spent a decade running from allied knight orders, so this was nothing. Dunkel watched him with a serious expression, noting that Klein was very different from others his age. He mentioned the hidden talent and the boy's spirit during the trial, admitting that he sometimes thought Klein might actually be the reincarnation of Archimond. Klein stiffened, warning Dunkel never to say that in front of the priest. Dunkel laughed it off, but the atmosphere remained heavy. Klein reflected on Archimond's legacy as a demon who killed millions, but his thoughts were interrupted by a woman's piercing scream. In a nearby village, a swarm of undead had arrived, causing the residents to flee in terror. Dunkel charged forward, his blade glowing with a golden light as he cut through the monsters. Klein stepped in to assist, his own sword wreathed in a faint purple aura. He told Dunkel to go save the people while he handled the remaining creatures. Dunkel obeyed, leaving Klein to finish off the undead. A villager thanked them for their help but asked who they were. Dunkel identified the youth as the second young master of the Rhineland family. The villagers were shocked, but Dunkel pressed them for information, asking when the creatures started appearing. A man explained that it began 2 months ago after the Count's family restricted access to the mine. People had been going missing, and he realized with horror that the undead they were fighting were actually the residents of their own village. A man suddenly lunged at Klein, grabbing his shoulders and demanding to know if he was really a Rhineland. Dunkel tried to intervene, but the man shouted that they had begged for help for months and received nothing. He wept over the corpse Klein had just cut down, revealing it was his father who had worked day and night at the mine. He cried out, asking why they had to suffer. Klein looked at the grieving man and told him he was too loud and should shut up. He asked why any of it was his fault, stating he wasn't the one who turned them into undead. He told the man to pick the right target if he wanted to vent his anger. Klein then raised his hand, channeling his Magi as he began a chant. He commanded the innocent spirits who died in sorrow, offering to light a guide's lantern to illuminate their path. He vowed as Klein Rhineland to uphold their will and told them to follow his guidance. Shimmering blue spirits rose from the fallen bodies, performing a soul resonance, a technique used 200 years ago to liberate the dead. The villager saw his father's spirit one last time before the entities began to communicate with Klein. After the spirits passed on, the man pointed the way to the mine. Dunkel asked what the spirits had said, and Klein replied that they thanked him for helping them pass and pleaded with him to get revenge. As they walked toward the mountain path, Dunkel looked at Klein's reflection in his blade. He recalled his earlier suspicion and asked the boy who exactly he was. Most people miss the real story. Subscribe if you want to see everything.